Hello friends, Reckless here. Today we're going to go over what are the thickest, coolest fatties we can sneak into play with Satoru Umezawa. This is a new card that was spoiled today. He's a 2/4 for 3. When you activate a ninjutsu ability, look at your top 3 cards, put one in hand, rest on the bottom of your library in any order, and you can only trigger it once per turn. And every creature in your hand has ninjutsu, 2 generic, 1 blue, 1 black. So what this means is you get to ninjutsu in and sneak in any huge creature in your hand that you want, right? Everything kind of becomes a ninja, except without getting the try. So let's get into it. First up, we have probably the best thing to cheat into play with Satoru. It's Blightsteel Colossus. It's an 11/11 trample, infect, indestructible. And it has some text here that we don't really care about. What's important though, it has infect. So whoever's getting hit by this is probably dying in one hit. That's pretty nutty. This card's going for, a pretty pricey 40 bucks, as we can see up here. And yeah, I think this is like a huge power upgrade to the deck. Second up, I have a Mind Leech Mass. This is kind of a, not really played card, very cheap. It's only $1. It's 7 mana, it's a 6/6 Trampler, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may look at that player's hand. If you do, you may cast a non-land card in it without paying that card's mana cost. This just seems like a perfect card to slot into a deck like this, because you're ninjutsuing it into play, it's already going to be tapped and attacking, and you're going to get value from that trigger. So if your opponent has, any time walks, things are going to get really crazy, but odds are your opponent has something in their hand that you will be able to take and cast for free. Next up, we have Surtland Elementalist. It's a 7-drop, 8/8. And whenever it attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery from your hand without paying its cost. Now this, even though it's the third card I brought up, I don't think this is like necessarily that great, but it's like a nice budget thing to slot in. And it's got some pretty high upside too, so it's just, obviously you're not getting immediate value from it enter the battle trigger. Also, you aren't getting value from the combat damage hitting when dealing combat damage trigger. So that's why, it's definitely like a tier 3 inclusion, but, could be worth. Next up, we have a card that actually does give you some pretty crazy value with its hit ability, and that's Lord of the Void, 7 mana for a 7/7 flyer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 7 cards of that player's library, then put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield under your control. Pretty memey, but should be good, especially if you can, usually you can suss out which players have more creatures in their deck. Unfortunately, with 7 cards, you're not actually getting, the biggest amount of looks, so you still have a reasonable whiff chance. It's kind of expensive at 13 bucks, so, maybe you want to include it, maybe you don't. But I think it could be pretty spinny, pretty fun, and it kind of scales well compared to what your opponents are playing, so, that's always interesting. Up next, we have another type of fatty to cheat into play, Hullbreaker Horror. It's a 7-drop, it has flash, can't be countered, oh, it's a 7/8, and when you cast a spell, choose up to 1, return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or return target online permanent to its owner's hand. So this is kind of like Tidespout Tyrant on drugs. Doesn't get value when you bring it into play, and doesn't get value on the connection, but if you're able to untap with it and play, it's gonna get pretty nutty, right? Like, you play a Ponder, a Preordain, bam, bam, you bounce a blocker, right? So now your next ninjutsu can get through a lot easier, you can connect a lot easier. Someone tries to remove it, you play a spell, bounce it to their hand. That may or may not always work, obviously depending on the cost of the spell they're trying to use to kill it. Yeah, but I think this is something worth considering. Now we got a pretty sweet card, Nezahal? Nezahal? I think that's how you say it. Primal Tide. 7 mana for a 7/7. Can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card, and discard 3 cards, exile it, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So what's really cool about this fatty is it's very durable, right? Like, you can protect it by discarding cards, and you actually get some pretty good card advantage value, because whenever someone plays a non-creature spell, you draw a card. So through a cycle of the table, odds are most people who try to kill this are going to try to play a non-creature spell, so at the very least you'll get to draw a card. And based off the Satoru trigger, and the Nezahal trigger, you should be pretty good on flickering it out at a very low opportunity cost. Yeah, I think it's just like a nice balance. Also, it being 7 mana means like you can actually cast this, just like with some of the other cards, like in a game that goes long. And this isn't necessarily going to draw a crazy amount of aggro. But what will draw aggro is Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur. This is the 10-drop, it's a 5/4, it has flash. At the beginning of your end step, draw 7 cards. Each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7. So in most cases, their maximum hand size will be reduced to 0, and at the end of their turn they will have to discard cards. So if Jin-Gitaxias gets to live until the end of your turn, bam, you get 7 cards. That's pretty sweet. I think this is one of the better things to put into a Satoru deck. And yeah, I don't know, not a whole lot more needs to be said about this one. Now we got a bit of a memeier pick with Sphinx Ambassador, 7 mana for a 5/5 flyer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, search that player's library for a card, then that player chooses a card name. If you search for a creature card that doesn't have that name, you may put that card onto the battlefield under your control. Then that player shuffles their library. So this is a really powerful connection effect. And there is a chance your opponent names the right thing, but if you think about how many creatures a player typically has in their deck, it's going to be a pretty high number, right? Like maybe really low you go to like 7, and really high you go to like 30, 45. So there's going to be a wide array of things for them to have to name, and you don't always have to necessarily get the absolute best thing in the deck, right? Don't be greedy, and then things become a lot harder for them. Also, there's a slight bonus in that your opponent might actually forget what's in their deck, and you pick the thing they forgot, right? Or they can't think of the name, or they just like kind of forget about it in the moment. You know, most people can't recite their deck lists. Like, you just sit them down, it's like, you have 1 minute, tell me every card in your deck, or tell me every creature in your deck. So, I think this will work really, really well. And a card in a similar vein is Master of Predicaments. 4/4 flyer for 5. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, choose a card in your hand. Then they guess whether the card's converted mana cost is greater than 4. If they guessed wrong, you may play the card without casting its cost, without paying its cost. So this is really interesting, because I think Satoru's going to want at least 11 fatties in it to cheat into ninjutsu into play. So if you get this in, and I'm not saying this is like a god tier pick, this is like kind of a meme one, it's a budget one if you really like mind games or politics. I think this is something worth considering, because also you could do the fact or fiction thing. But yeah, back to my previous point of, if your deck has a high amount of cards in it that just kind of win the game or do something disgusting, more often than not, they're going to want to pick greater than 4. Because the downside of them picking greater than 4 is so high, even though maybe your deck doesn't actually have a high percentage of that. And they're kind of okay with you just putting in, like, you know, oh, you cast Fabricate for free. Good job. Next up, we have Runescar Demon. This is a 7 mana 6/6 flyer. And when it enters the battlefield, Demonic Tutor. This is kind of like, it's a good card in Kalia, right? Like, and I think it'll kind of serve a similar role here, where it's a pretty reasonable thing to cheat into play, but it's not necessarily broken. Like, you don't always want to see this in your hand as like the thing you're weaseling in. But at the same time, it's like, it's fine. It'll fetch like the next thing you want to cheat into play. It's just like a good curve filler, essentially. And next up, we have Kozilek the Great Distortion. I think this will be pretty cool, since obviously you do not get the cast trigger. Kozilek's 10 mana, 2 colorless, and 8 generic for a 12/12. Has Menace, so it should be able to keep hitting reasonably-ish. But the reason I selected Kozilek is due to his I don't know Kozilek's gender. I'm sure it has one. Emrakul's a her, apparently. Discard a card with CMC cost X, counter target spell with CMC cost X, or mana value, I believe is the new term. So if, you know, you resolve some good card drawing action, if you get Jin-Gitaxias in play, or like you play a Fact or Fiction, you know, you can stop a lot of things, right? And if you fill your deck with cheap stuff and your opponent tries to remove your Kozilek, right, you'll probably, usually removal's cheap, so you can discard your cheap spells to counter that and protect itself. So I think it's a fine thing to weasel in. It's a little on the pricier side, $17, so like I could see maybe not wanting to play it, but yeah. If you're looking for more thick, cool fatties to put in a Satoru deck, check the description And I've included a link to the other cards that I looked at, pondered, that didn't quite make the video, but I still think are worth considering. Some of them kind of didn't make the cut because they require a little more setup, and I wanted to include kind of like a good spread of very expensive cards and very cheap cards that could just kind of consistently be thrown out regardless of how you choose to build the deck. So check that out, and if you want more Magic the Gathering content, consider ninjutsuing that like button. It helps me out, and you could brainstorm that subscribe button if you want more content like this. See you next time.